Ahoy, and welcome in to another mind expanding episode of Not Allowed to Die, your podcast about mental health treatment from the therapist perspective. I am your host, Dan Megler, social worker and life enthusiast. And alongside me, as always, is Mariska, the three-toothed Patterdale Terrier, and she is not licking her paws. And we know what that means, you Mariskateers, you Mariskovites. We know it means that you have been doing an excellent job of rating, reviewing, and telling a friend about the podcast. So, you're out at that barbecue with your neighbors Joni and Chachi, and they are, thinking about mental health treatment and they're not sure where to go next. You can say, I've got a podcast for you. And they can go through the back catalog and listen to things. Mariska also wants me to remind you that we are also creating this podcast in part to draw attention to Paws for Patrick. Paws for Patrick is a nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing the love of animals to people who need it the most. So if you know a young person, 30 and younger, who could benefit from getting an emotional support animal, tell them to go to pawsforpatrick.org. If they need help adopting, if they adopt from a shelter, Paws for Patrick can reimburse them. And if they need help getting an ESA letter, Paws for Patrick will hook them up with a therapist who will write that ESA letter for them so they can live in no pet housing, not have to pay pet fees or a pet deposit. Well, Mariska can barely contain herself, because you know how she gets when we have a guest. And she's very excited for our guest today, because this is someone who's going to educate us about something that I hadn't heard as much about. So today we have Ann Russo. She is a therapist, author, and creator of Religious Trauma Treatment Model. She's the founder and clinical director of AMR Therapy, a remote mental health practice. Her work focuses on religious trauma, sexual empowerment, and queer issues. And she has a forthcoming book with Pessy on handling religious trauma. So Ann, thank you so much for joining us. And can you tell us a little bit about your journey to how you got here?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you so much for bringing me on today. I'm really excited to talk and share with your audience about what's going on. And I love that you're such a huge animal advocate too. I think that is fantastic. So awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Well, my journey started when I was just a wee one. I was raised in a queer household from the time I was 5 years old, and this was back in the 1980s. So I experienced a lot of challenges around that from the outside world. We were a secretive family. We didn't talk about dad's sexual orientation because of just how the world was really at that time around gay parenting. I don't even think was a thing, and if it was a thing, it was secretive everywhere, right? So we didn't really have the community, and we didn't have mental health and therapists to support us in that journey who could fully understand and relate to that. And as I got older, unfortunately, I saw that a lot of the homophobia or hate or lack of understanding around what it means to be a queer person was coming out of religion. So I actually joined a church when I was 18, a Christian church. I was very curious of who are these folks that don't like us, like what's going on here. And, I met a woman that I was very into, at 18, who was part of this church. And there was just this wild journey of understanding religion and queerness. And I went on and I studied religion. I studied theology. I got my master's in theology. I was just trying to reconcile and understand what this was and the harm that it caused to queer folks. So I really wanted to work in the intersection of queerness and Christianity for a really long time. So I went on and I got my master's to work as a therapist with a focus on queerness and Christianity. And then as time went on, I realized that religious trauma was not just an experience of the queer community. Religious trauma could happen to anyone, anywhere who have been exposed to what I refer to as like high control religious environments. And here I am today, working in religious trauma, and I see a lot of concerns, issues, mental health struggles around sexuality in general, not just queer sexuality or orientation. So sexual empowerment is a big part of my work. Alternative relationship structures is a big part of my work. understanding religion, and I run a practice with about 15 therapists, and we all specialize in different pieces of this work for marginalized and oppressed communities. We're a diverse group, and I'm really proud of that work. And as you mentioned, now I'm under contract to write a book, and I'm plugging away at it around this religious trauma treatment model.
Well, when you said religious trauma, I mean, it could encompass so many things. I think of a client that I had who she was in my office and she was in distress because her church taught that if you died by suicide, you couldn't be saved and you would go to hell. And
Yeah.
if you didn't accept Christ as your personal savior, you were going to go to hell. And her father had died by suicide, and her mother had grown up Catholic and was just kind of a lapsed Catholic and was not in the same church she was in. And so she was saying, I don't know what to do because I've already lost my father to damnation and, I'm worried about my mom's soul. And to me, that's traumatic. She's already
Oh,
dealing with the trauma of, so is that but again, when you say religious trauma, I'm sure there's a lot that it can encompass, but is that what kinds of things if a person's hearing this and they say, I've had some bad experiences at church or felt judged, what might be religious trauma that they might be thinking, I could maybe seek some support for this?
sure. And so I want to add this caveat on here because I think it's really important as we speak about religion. There's not a condemnation of religion or faith. And I want to make that very, very clear. Like, this model does not do that. And it's not for people, well, you must leave your faith or you have to have left your faith in order to participate in this model. And oftentimes clients may not even see what they've experienced as a trauma. And I don't want to say, like, well, your religion has caused trauma, but you may have experienced trauma from aspects of your religious teachings, even if you
Hmm.
still believe them and continue to believe them, right? And when we're talking about religious trauma, we are talking about some, like, when we think about trauma in general, we're talking about body reactions, we're talking about anxiety, we're talking about depression, we're talking about hypervigilance, somatic reactions, stress around certain beliefs, how you're interacting with the world at large, your job, your relationships. It's trauma, right? And it's coming from an experience or a teaching related to your faith or the faith of someone else. So you can experience religion, like your client, the trauma that I feel as you're describing. It's not my church is causing me trauma per se, but it's this outside event happened. This teaching is coming together, and this uh, accumulation of all of these things is which is creating the trauma, because she wouldn't necessarily have the trauma if those events weren't happening around her,
Hmm.
right? Like, father
Right.
had it, so it's like we'd have to look at that. I would still consider it to be religious trauma, but I don't know if she would consider it to be religious trauma. So we'd have
Yeah.
to work very you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, it'd be a really, like, interesting conversation to explore what that meant for her.
Well, and I think, something you brought up there is that there is a misconception that people, particularly in the queer community, are not religious or wouldn't want to have a religious faith and a connection to spirituality. And we know that a religious faith can be a huge resiliency factor for people.
Yes.
But for people who have stepped away or found something in the faith community that they grew up in that they did need to move away from, for a lot of people, there can be this huge sense of grief and this need to replace something, and the difficulty of finding how do I replace and as a therapist, I sometimes find myself wanting to suggest, well, have you thought of checking out this church or this other thing to fill some of that void? But then again, that's still not addressing just the feeling of loss of the community that I grew up with. So any thoughts on just how do we help people through the loss of what they grew up with and what they spend so much time believing and now questioning?
Absolutely. So I do lean into the model for this work, because the first step is always what's happening in the body. So I
Hmm.
always want to address the feeling of hypervigilance that they may feel in their body. the triggers they may feel that are in their body. So I want them to feel safe to even begin to have these conversations, because it is very painful. What we're talking about here is the idea that many of these people feel like there isn't a place for them even in the afterlife, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if there's well, I had to leave this church, how much are they still carrying that I'm eternally damned?
Mm-hmm.
There's no place for faith, right? So I feel like we have to do that work first, just to get their system really ready to
Mm-hmm.
explore what that means, and then walk them through a series of questions to help them understand what has happened, right? Like, what does trauma look like? How does it show up? How do we get to a place of believing something so deeply? Just
Mm-hmm.
in general, looking at evidence-based practice and different models of understanding, like, how does our brain work if you're exposed to something when you're so young, and how does that feel true, and how does that feel true in our bodies? And so this, like, deep educational work, and then once those pieces are in place, then I start looking at where did those specific messages come from,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the work is, I call it like like an inherited belief system. Like, is it really yours? How was it taught to you? What was taught to you? Do some of those things still feel true to you today? Like, I mean, we do like a really deep dive into that level of work. And in time, through this work, they are able to start finding their own value systems. And some things may still align very much with the previous faith, but it doesn't necessarily always align, right? Like, you're not like moving, like, they understand that sexual orientation is not sinful and doesn't mean you can't have a relationship with God, like, going deep into that work. And then once you find some alignment, then they can start to practice. And then when they're in that space of practice, that's when I think it's time to look at, okay, how do we sustain this? Do we sustain this in a new church environment? Do we sustain this in a specific spiritual practice? So it's like, so for me, where do we go from here is the last space we go
Mm-hmm.
to, because we have all these other areas that need some significant addressing because of the level of trauma. And it's not, and when we think about it, Dan, right, this level of trauma is not a one-time event.
Mm-hmm.
This is constant, and especially if you grew up in it, it's just constant rupture of self, right? And we're still in a society that those triggers are going to happen all the time still.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of like what I'm hearing you say, and I was just thinking as you're speaking, like if I'm working with any kind of survivor of trauma, so let's say it was child sexual trauma,
Mm,
again, the problem for most of these people, the good news is they're going to be able to go on and form normal, healthy relationships, and sex is not necessarily going to be the problem. The problem is their own identity and their feeling that, okay, this universe dislikes me and I am bad because of something that I've learned, something I've experienced. And so it's helping them to look at, where did this come from and why, how do I let that go? And how do I keep the things that are good and let go of the things that are bad as I create a new narrative or a new idea? And again, I think the religion being so tied up in this, because for so many people, we can endure almost any pain if we can put it into a context, and religion really can really help us do that. But
sure,
so
sure.
this piece of identity, where do I fit, and how does the universe see me? So is that kind of part of how you work?
Oh, yeah, so true, right? Because one of the biggest concerns with a high control religious system is you don't have an identity.
Hmm.
You're told what your identity is, and you exist in like a almost a Borg state,
Yeah.
within this group, and questioning anything within that state is not allowed.
Hmm.
So a big piece of this, yes, is like, what is my identity outside of this? And what does it mean to be autonomous? And that's not necessarily not holding some of those beliefs. And I like to really reinforce that piece, because there hasn't been a model that allows for that yet. Like, this is
Hmm.
the first model that says, like, hey, you don't have to be gone. And I just want to keep reinforcing that piece, because I don't want people to feel like, well, I do believe this, so I can't work on this.
Hmm.
You
Right.
can. You can work on the parts that are harming you, for sure.
So for therapists who want to learn more about like this model, it's not that they have to be experts in every religion. It's more about understanding how to listen and hear where the pain is coming from, and where the disconnects between logic and sort of self-loathing are existing, and how that's triggering other emotions and those physical feelings.
Totally. And what I try to do in the book is to show examples how this can show up in different faith systems or different religious systems, so therapists can go, oh, wait a minute, something here, there might be something here to this. So yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, to be a specializer or an expert or understand all the faith systems is quite a bit. But if you understand how high control religious systems impact a person, you can start to see, okay, wait a minute, I wonder if it's tied to some religious stuff here. And that's the goal, to understand that. And then you can absolutely work through this model to help your client. 100%. Yeah.
I think I think there's a lot of people who have not grown up in a high control religious system who question, why would anyone who is especially older want to join into something like this? And they don't realize, like, for everything there's a benefit. And I think for some people, that idea that, okay, this other, like, the religion has all the answers for me, I don't have to live with that ambiguity, and I don't have to live in this state of wondering what is right and wrong, because there's a leader or there's a book or there's whatever else that will tell me that.
Yeah.
And how do I live in this space of ambiguity? So is that also part of the healing, is to increase people's comfort level with, if I've lost this high control answer factory, so how do I trust myself to live in ambiguity?
Yes, if that is their path.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, right? Because it may not be, but
Hmm.
it may very well be too. So
Hmm.
I mean, I don't mean myself to sound ambiguous when I'm
No, that's, but you're being
saying that,
honest. It's a very
but it's
individual
like, if
thing, right?
yeah, but if they're saying, if they're like, this isn't working for me,
Hmm.
then yes, you were going to confront some of that stuff that we're talking about. But if they're like, no, this totally works for me. My issue is that, and I have this example in the book, a client who comes and says, my wife wants me to be here because she says that my praying is impacting our lives. So
Hmm.
there's like OCD in his praying, but he's very involved in a high control faith. He's totally fine with his involvement in a high control faith. What out of control was the level of praying that was taking place, not anything within the belief itself. So you could still use this model. Like, I wouldn't say to him, well, you're traumatized by religion, but I would say, okay, the way you're viewing this right now is creating this prank. Let's talk about this. And you can still use the same model. What's happening in your body? What is, what's going on? Let's look at this. Let's talk about it. Let's understand this. What holds true? Okay, everything still holds true. Great. Okay. So now let's look at, if you I have to pray because I am afraid God's going to punish me. So we have to work against that. And we know those models anyway, right? Like,
Hmm.
using CBT and different things, even using DBT
Hmm.
helps in situations like this. So it's like you're really trying to help the client understand, but not push them one way or the other. You're trying to help them work on that rupture.
But I'm glad you brought up the couples concept, because that was going to be my next question. Is, I'm guessing that there's a lot of space for helping in, a couple dynamic, and helping the partners to understand each other's perspectives, especially if they were raised in different faith experiences, or if one person has had some traumatic experiences in a church system, and they're really aggressively rejecting their partner's need or desire to have faith there. So is that part of the education you provide, is also how to help couples therapists working with this?
Yeah. Yeah. I have worked with couples through that. The challenges that I've seen mostly is Most couples, oddly enough, that I've worked with, I haven't really experienced couples not being generally on the same page. Like, even if it's like, well, I'm not as into this, like, for whatever reason, I've seen, I have to dive into this a little more, but I've seen them be generally like able to be okay. The issue that I really see comes up around sex.
Mm-hmm.
Because of a lot of, especially within like the Christian paradigm and in Islam too. But I mean, again, it doesn't really matter. But the idea of, sex is for marriage, a purity culture,
Mm-hmm.
there's not really a sexual empowerment movement within religions.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a lot of issues when people get married.
Oh,
You know,
absolutely.
so it's like this expectation. Well, now we're married. Everything I've ever been taught about this can just go out the window. That's just not how we work. Right. So there's a lot of work around sexual relationships when it comes to faith and purity culture.
Mm-hmm. When you tell people that you work in this space with religious trauma, what are some misconceptions that you've seen people come to, or even, when they're coming to work with you, that you have to help to educate? I'm guessing that that you are just anti-religion would be a misconception, but
Yes.
other misconceptions that that pop up.
Yes. So yes, that I'm anti-religion, or that I think people should not be religious as well.
Mm-hmm.
That to work on religious trauma is for them to have to leave their faith.
Mm-hmm.
The idea sometimes that I am more religious than I am as well comes up.
Okay.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting, but that has come up. And if I have an agenda,
Mm-hmm.
that's why, like, an agenda to pull people away from faith. And that's why, as we're talking today, I'm really trying to emphasize that that's not what this is about at all. It's not bringing myself into the therapy room in that way.
How do you decide? How do you decide how much self-disclosure, though, to utilize? Again, for me, I'm very upfront with, if when it comes up with most of my clients, I'm personally agnostic. So again, I think that does make it easy for me to come from a non-judgmental place, because I say I don't know what the right or wrong thing is. I'm open to anything being possible. I'm not going to try to convince you of anything. But if I were a person who was of a strong faith, I wonder if that could impact the dynamic as I'm talking to clients.
It's funny because what has happened a few times is when I'm working with families,
Mm-hmm.
the especially around queerness, this has happened several times where I have a client where they want to bring in their family, and their family happens to be in a very conservative faith, and the family is really hesitant to come and sit in a session
Mm-hmm.
because the assumption, I think, in which I actually can completely understand it, the assumption is that I'm going to be very anti their faith, and I'm going to come out really harsh and against them. So that's something that I've had to work really hard at explaining to folks, that I understand, uh, and I do understand, especially evangelical or fundamentalist Christian. I get that very well, but I will always be 100% accepting of that being their belief system, and it being more than just a belief system. It just is. Right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
difference. It's not a belief system to them. So I
Mm-hmm.
come into the space of like, okay, this is. So I'm going to be in
Mm-hmm.
your world too while we're talking about this. And I think that sometimes people are surprised that I'll hold myself in that way, where it's like I will really hold myself to being a facilitator of communication and
Mm-hmm.
understanding, rather than like, well, I'm taking the queer side because I'm a queer person.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that's my role in the therapy space.
Yeah, but it
You
is
know,
often it's a hard thing, though, sometimes when we want to work in the world that the client brings in, but then if we feel that some of the things that they're bringing in with them are toxic for them, and it's a hard place to decide, where do I kind of say, hey, can I interrupt you there or ask you to think about this other space, because it's I'm seeing your goals and they're impacting you because you have this belief, this fixed belief that to me is irrational, but to them is an article of faith.
Yeah.
So that's got to
Yeah.
be a hard piece
It,
to
it,
navigate.
it is slow work.
Hmm.
I mean, there are some clients that I have that are queer, and they come from these spaces, and they were in these spaces even before I started working with them. And it's just this very, very slow work into helping them understand what they truly believe versus what a church may have taught them, compared to like what the broader faith may. So it's like it's intense work,
Hmm.
so it's like I'm just always asking the questions, and sometimes they'll land on things that I totally don't agree with, but fine. But when they do that level of work, I do see a comfort start to exist within them, and I do see that they're able to move away from that level of trauma and harm. Now, on a personal note, do I think that some of these things can still be harmful? Well, yeah, I do, right? But I think it would probably be more harmful if I was like, well, that's dumb. I mean, I
Yeah.
wouldn't say that, right? But
Yeah.
gee, this is harming. Like, I would feel like I'd lose the alliance, and
Hmm.
they may not return to therapy, and then they're just actually more in a harm spiral. So it's like I trying to weigh all that out based on where they're coming from.
Well, and it's kind of like analogous to for me of when I have a client that is in a relationship, a romantic relationship that seems somewhat toxic or problematic. It's not my job to say, if I say you must break up with this person, they're probably going to break up with therapy. But if I
Yeah,
say, well, hey, what are you enjoying about this? What's working for you here? And can we shift and can we work through? And what's your line on when this would be uncomfortable for you to a point where it needs to stop? Okay.
totally, totally. And and the other thing that I'm very candid with my clients, and they may make certain decisions here or there, and I always just reinforce like, hey, look, I know this is what you're saying today, and I totally support that. If something changes for you, I still got your back. Like, you never have, I want you to know that from my end, just being a human being, like, I hope that you don't feel any kind of way that I'm still not going to be here to support you, or that you
Hmm.
can't share things with me if it goes in another direction. Like, it's all good. Like, I'm here to help you walk through this, whatever that may look like. And I feel like that does help.
Hmm. That again, that goal we have that they feel like they're never going to be judged with us.
Yes.
Are are there pieces of media? I mean, I'm thinking of I really enjoyed, and I don't know what you think of her, but Glennon Doyle's book Untamed, because it really helped me to see in her discussions with her wife about her wife being really, hey, I had some bad experiences with the church. I never felt welcome there. And her desire to give her wife a new paradigm of how spirituality can be viewed. But are there books you recommend or films for your clients that you say, hey, this might give you a different lens that might help you to, anything that you found yourself recommending a good bit?
Yeah, yeah, I do. And again, it just depends on where they are.
Hmm.
If they're really looking to deconstruct faith, I may lean very heavily into actual theological books
Hmm.
more than I would about religious trauma. Like, if I will encourage them to, like, all right, well, read, for example, this particular New Testament book, and let's come back and like talk about what that was, how that impacted you, how you understand, you know, Jesus and this gospel versus maybe some of the things, some of the messaging that you may receive from your church. Let's try to parse through. So I like to have them like it just depends, because like I might even say like, hey, watch, but I'm a cheerleader, and like
Hmm.
see,
Oh yeah, I
you
love
know
that
what
one.
I mean? So it's like it just so depends. Like, there's like Jesus can't, like, there's just all these different angles of just where they're coming from. So it's hard to say like this is the thing for sure, but I definitely pull on all the different kinds of media, podcasts to movies to literal books on theology.
Hmm.
Worksheets. I mean, all kinds of stuff, Dan, really.
Okay.
But yeah,
I'm
I'm a
gonna
cheerleader, yeah.
I'm gonna have to revisit though. But I'm a cheerleader. I can't think of is her name Natasha, the one who's in Poker Face, and I
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
ever see
Natasha
her without.
Leone. Yeah,
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 Natasha
she's
Leone. I
great.
can't ever
Yeah.
see her without thinking of that movie.
Yes.
Well, you also do a good bit of work around sex positivity and helping to reframe ideas about sexuality. But there are misconceptions in that area too. Are there some that come to mind that you think when we talk about sex positivity, people think this, and you're hoping they can have a more expansive view, or so? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that topic?
Totally, totally. And it's ironic too, like working in sex positivity and working in religion sometimes, because I go, all right, this part of me does this, and I think people are going to have a misconception that I'm saying like go sleep with everybody, and which is a get it's like it's what I mean, like it's so sometimes I feel like it for me it's like totally intuitive, but I can see
Hmm.
for others it might be counterintuitive.
Hmm.
But I digress. The thing that I that I really look at with the sex positivity and sexual empowerment is about what makes sense for you as an individual.
Hmm.
So sex positivity is not about necessarily being very sexual. It can be about accepting your asexuality and being proud about that, or what enthusiastic consent really looks like, and what enjoying sex and it being a pleasurable thing is sex positive. Like it literally can be anything that is authentic and authentically consented to.
Hmm.
And so it's and obviously not harming other people in the process.
Right, that we could
Does
be
that
sex
answer the
positive.
question?
Oh, 100%. But it doesn't, just like with religion, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And
Mm.
I used to do a lot of work about trying to help men be more active in standing up against sexual assault and intimate partner violence. And what I'm trying to teach my sons is I don't seeking consent is just that's the basement. We're looking for enthusiasm. So I love how you said enthusiastic consent. That's where we
Yes,
want, and that's winning for everyone. But we can still be people of faith, and we can still say, I don't want to have sex till marriage if that's what you want or whatnot, but be
yes.
sex positive. That there's no mutual
Exactly.
exclusivity on this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that viewing sex and sexuality as bad or wrong is a problem,
Hmm.
right? Like I think that causes harm because it is a natural part of who we are, including asexuality. Like I don't want to leave those folks out because I feel like they get left out a lot too. That is a very valid way to express sexuality by not expressing sexuality
Hmm.
and feeling like you can safely consent to not being sexual, because I feel like there's a lot of pressure put on that community to force themselves to be sexual or be viewed like there's something wrong with them. So
100%.
yeah.
I was just sorry, a quick story. I One of my former clients, who is now a friend and a therapist and whatnot, but she was messaging me because she thought of herself as aro ace, aromantic asexual for probably 15 years, and has recently delved into dating, and has this girlfriend, but she was saying, I think I may have to blow things up because I'm really content where things are, but I don't think I'll ever want to get past the cuddling stage. And I said, and your partner's not saying there's any issue with this. So I think you guys just might need to have a conversation. We don't have to blow this up just because. And they had a great conversation, and all things are still on track. But I think even with that people can all the misconceptions that people can be romantic without being sexual and have amazing relationships.
Exactly the pressure that I see people put on themselves one way or the other too.
Hmm.
Like just even for cis men is how you're supposed to show up sexually as well, and I'm sorry, but I think it's crap. I think it's
Hmm.
absolute crap. It's a very individual thing. There is a spectrum of how we do this, and I think we have to learn as best as we can to respect ourselves and respect others, because I've seen and heard some pretty unfortunate things said about people that don't show up the way someone else wants them to show up, or how society wants them to show up in that world. So the work there is building up self-worth too, self-worth and self-esteem, and doing that deeper dive into who you are versus who you're told to be.
But I think, as we live in this society where, and even very recently, we've extended adolescence from going to 18 to now pretty much going to like 26. And we have these faith models that, we're saying, hey, you're ready for your bar mitzvah or your bat mitzvah at 13. You're ready to be an adult in this way. And we had some sexual concepts that were saying where marriage is supposed to fit in. And so now we have these people who are dealing with this extended adolescent period where they're supposed to be exploring, but now they're violating tenets of their faith, or they're saying, I'm still not supposed to be fully an adult yet because I can't even get my own health insurance. And yet, so I'm living these experiences and I'm going out and dating, doing these things, and yet I have to ignore them and say and make these caveats in my mind of, well, this doesn't count because it's X, Y, or Z. And so we're putting people in a really hard position with faiths that are not necessarily really, many of them that are not adapting to this longer period of adolescence. That, I mean, and even I really think that this shift from 18 to 26 becoming the new adult is very new, but I see it happening everywhere. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh my gosh, I totally do. And I completely agree with you. And, I think that sometimes and no disrespect to any religions, but we ourselves kind of embed certain rules based on our times and the culture of the time and what we understand about the world, what we understand about humans. And it's like, well, okay, well, we live to 30, so you better be married off at 13, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now that we understand that the brain isn't even fully developed till you're 26 and people, are living into their 80s, I guess I would ask, how is the extension of adolescence harming a belief system in God?
Mm-hmm.
That would be the question that I would want to ask folks. And I really would be curious. Like, you have these ceremonies of becoming an adult,
Mm-hmm.
but now we know that we live longer. We understand the brain more. How do you think, that an all-knowing, like a God would be upset that information is understood? I mean, I would be very curious. Like, tell me how that impacts God or your faith in God.
Mm-hmm. Well, and back to this idea of lacking now for so many people rituals that confer adulthood,
Yeah.
particularly for cis het men. The expectation is, well, I have to consistently prove my manhood by having sex with many female partners, and that's the only way that's the way I get my man card. And so sexuality becomes performative in getting this, because we don't have some better way of getting that through, and I must constantly be performing. So we're setting people up for, and I've often said to people, you can say there's nothing wrong. When you say I do, that's it. You're not going to have any other partners. But if you've been practicing having as many partners as possible from age 15 to age 30, it's going to be a pretty hard thing to turn off, because that's
Yes.
become the behavior that you've been working with. And it's no shade on it. It's just, if the ultimate goal is a multi-decade partnership, how are we training ourselves for what we would like to have? It's not about right or wrong, good or bad. It's what do you want, and how are we training ourselves to be sustainable?
Oh my God, I love what you're saying right now. Because it's just so, you're just talking about the way humans work.
Mm-hmm.
Like this, like whether we like it or not, we are pattern oriented. We have neural pathways that form a certain way. We biologically grow this way. These are just what it means to be a human, right? So are we trying to constrict what it means to be a human in these little boxes that don't actually make sense for the realities of what it means to be a human, especially living as long as we're living now? And our society needs different things than what it needed 1,000 years ago, right? It's different. So it's like, what my feeling is that culture and religion, the way we practice, ultimately will have to shift, in order to meet the realities of what it means to be a human being. But I don't think a belief in God or a faith necessarily has to shift.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of the difference right there, right? Like the dogma of the faith versus having a faith.
Hmm. Well, I was just recently, I love audiobooks, and I was listening to The Color Purple, and I had never read it or listened to it before. And I'm not sure if you read it, but the faith that the characters were creating in there and co-creating and saying as a rejection of one faith and an embracing of, hey, this doesn't have to be a person as a god. We can have nature. We can have a connection to that.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
helping people and people being not afraid to explore with one another and to say, what is working for me in this world that I'm living in to allow me to have a connection to something greater. I think that's what we
Yes.
want people to be able to have as a form, as a way of feeling like they can be more resilient through the hard times.
Oh, absolutely. Right. And that's why that high control religious system can be so damaging, because it specifically tells you from that young age that you can't even have a thought of looking outside this very
Hmm.
strict belief system.
Right. There's only the one way. And if you're not part of that way, then you're wrong, you're bad, you're an apostate, whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. So that is the piece that makes it difficult. But I really hope that the work that we're doing will help people explore a little bit deeper, even if they still land in that space, that it's because it lands for them, not because it's been programmed into them out of fear.
Hmm. Are there any of the just general messages about mental health treatment that you would like to share with the audience, just to, say, hey, if you're considering treatment, you might want to also think XYZ?
um I would say, considering mental health treatment, I think everyone should have some level of mental health treatment. I think I mean, and not just because I do the work, but I'm also a client. But
All
you
right.
know, like yeah, I believe in it. I really, really do believe in it, and I believe in it not because, well, you have a mental health illness and we better like deal with this illness or pathologizing. I believe in it because if you're with the right therapist for you, they're going to help you answer some of those existential questions. They're going to help you align your value system with the way that you live. They're going to help you really understand who you are as a person and the kind of life that you want to live and the kind of boundaries that. So I see it as this all-encompassing growth move, working with the right provider. And with that, ask the provider questions. Like, you have every right to be like, tell me a little bit about how you practice. Have you ever worked with a person XYZ? What was that like for you? Like, hey, what did you specialize in? Like, real, like you can put the provider to task and
Hmm.
see if it's a good fit for you or not. And my hope is that some of these insurance rules and things like that can change and make this easier, because I know it's not always, just finding someone can be so difficult. So I would say also our job as mental health providers and listeners out there who are mental health providers, we have to continue to advocate for this space, because uh, so many people truly, truly need it, want it, and will greatly benefit from it.
Hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, where can people find out more about you, or if people are interested in working with you, where might they be able to connect?
So if you want to work with me specifically, you can go to annrusso.org. If you want to work with one of the clinicians at AMR Therapy, it's amrtherapy.com.
Good, very
So
clear, very clear. That's
yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
excellent.
Yeah, try to keep it super clear. And I always invite comments, critiques, concerns, ideas, because we're all growing, and I'm definitely not exempt from that process. So please feel free to email me and reach out.
Well, this has been a very, again, enlightening conversation. I really appreciate your time today. And for
Thanks.
any of you listeners, if you have questions for Mariska or for me, remember to email us at dmaiglerlcsw@gmail.com. And until we speak again, do whatever it takes to get you through this world. And remember, you are just not allowed to die.